What happens when arrogance meets lethal precision in the depths of the American wilderness? This is the untold story of how one man's quest for freedom became a legend that would echo through generations. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival, strategy, and ultimate justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. This is a story you'll never forget, and you won't want to miss others like it. The Georgia wilderness stretched endlessly under the oppressive summer heat of 1863, its canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in an eerie twilight. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks, and the air was thick with humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. But for Isaiah Washington, this suffocating landscape wasn't a prison. It was home, sanctuary, and now his battlefield. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands that could span a man's head, Isaiah was an imposing figure, even in an age when hard labor built hard men. His dark skin bore the scars of both slavery and war, the raised welts from overseers' whips crisscrossed with the pale lines of Confederate bullets that had found their mark but failed to kill him. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Dark as midnight and sharp as winter steel, they held the kind of intelligence that made plantation owners nervous, and the kind of resolve that had been forged in the crucible of America's bloodiest conflict. These were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer and had chosen to fight back rather than surrender. Isaiah's journey to this moment had begun 28 years earlier on the Whitfield plantation, where he had been born into bondage to a woman whose name he barely remembered. She had died when he was 7, worked to death in the cotton fields under the merciless Georgia sun. From that day forward, he had been raised by the other slaves, learning not just how to survive but how to think, how to plan, and most importantly, how to wait for the right moment. That moment had come with the war. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Isaiah had done what thousands of other enslaved men had done. He had run toward the Union lines, seeking freedom and the chance to fight for it. But unlike most, he had brought with him skills that made him invaluable to the Union cause. Growing up on a plantation had taught him to move silently through forests, to track game across impossible terrain, and to make every shot count when ammunition was precious. The old slave who had taught him to hunt, a man called Moses, who claimed to have been a warrior in Africa before his capture, had passed down knowledge that went far beyond simple marksmanship. "A gun is just a tool," Moses had told him during those secret lessons in the deep woods. But a man who understands wind, distance, patience, and fear, that man becomes death itself. The Union Army had recognized Isaiah's potential immediately. Within weeks of his arrival at a recruitment camp in Maryland, he had been assigned to the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army. But his true calling had come when a sharp-eyed colonel named Robert Gould Shaw had watched him put 5 consecutive shots through a playing card at 300 yards. "Son," Shaw had said, his voice filled with quiet amazement, "I think we've found your calling." And so Isaiah Washington had become something the Confederacy had never imagined in their worst nightmares. A freed slave with a rifle, the training to use it, and every reason in the world to want them dead. His first confirmed kill had come at the Battle of Antietam, where he had put a bullet through a Confederate artillery officer at a range that defied belief. The shot had silenced an entire battery of cannons that had been tearing Union forces apart, and word of the impossible shot had spread through both armies like wildfire. By Gettysburg, he had earned a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Ghost of Gettysburg. Confederate soldiers spoke his name in whispers, claiming he could appear anywhere, anytime, and that no distance was too great for his rifle. Some said he wasn't human at all, but a spirit of vengeance sent to punish the South for its sins. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. Isaiah Washington was very much human, but he was a human being who had been pushed beyond the breaking point and had discovered that he possessed a gift for dealing death at impossible distances. More than that, he had learned to use the very prejudices of his enemies against them. Confederate officers, raised on the myth of white supremacy, simply couldn't conceive that a former slave could outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight them. This blind spot made them predictable, and predictable enemies were dead enemies. By the summer of 1863, Isaiah's reputation had grown to legendary proportions. He had killed over 200 Confederate soldiers, including dozens of officers, and had never once been wounded in return. His methods were as varied as they were effective. Sometimes he would take impossible shots from distances measured in miles. Other times he would infiltrate enemy camps and eliminate targets with a knife, leaving behind no trace except the bodies. But it was his psychological warfare that truly set him apart. Isaiah understood that fear was a weapon more powerful than any bullet. A dead officer was a tactical victory, but a terrified army was a strategic one. He would leave calling cards with his victims, a single playing card, the ace of spades, with ghost written in his careful handwriting. Confederate soldiers would find these cards and know that death itself was stalking them. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this. The oppressor's greatest weakness was his inability to imagine that the oppressed might fight back with intelligence, skill, and deadly purpose. Now, as he moved through the Georgia wilderness with the easy grace of a man in his element, Isaiah was about to teach that lesson to a new group of students. Colonel Marcus Whitfield and his hunting party thought they were pursuing a runaway slave, a piece of property to be reclaimed and punished. They had no idea they were walking into the domain of the most dangerous man in America. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legend, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. In the suffocating heat of a Georgia summer, among the cypress trees and Spanish moss of Devil's Hollow, the hunter was about to become the hunted. And Isaiah Washington was ready to teach them all a lesson they would never forget, assuming any of them lived long enough to remember it. Colonel Marcus Whitfield adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and surveyed his hunting party with the satisfaction of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 43, he was the embodiment of Southern aristocracy, tall, lean, with the kind of pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His family had owned the Whitfield plantation for 3 generations, and he had been raised from birth to believe that his position at the top of the social hierarchy was not just natural, but divinely ordained. The 5 men who flanked him represented the best manhunters money could buy in the state of Georgia. These weren't ordinary overseers content to chase down the occasional runaway with dogs and whips. These were professionals, men who had made careers out of tracking human beings across the most treacherous terrain the South had to offer. Thomas Briggs, Whitfield's lead overseer, was a weathered man in his 50s, whose face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades studying tracks and signs. He had been hunting runaway slaves for over 20 years, and his success rate was legendary among plantation owners. Briggs could track a man across solid rock, through running water, and over terrain that would challenge an Apache scout. Jake Morrison, at 25, was the youngest of the group, but his youth was balanced by an almost supernatural ability to read the forest. He could tell you what animals had passed through an area, when they had passed, and where they were likely to be found. More importantly for their current mission, he could do the same with human quarry. Samuel Cross was the group's expert marksman, a man who could put a bullet through a silver dollar at 200 yards with the kind of casual precision that made other men shake their heads in amazement. He carried a custom-made rifle that had cost more than most men made in a year, and he maintained it with the devotion of a priest tending to a sacred relic. Peters, whose first name seemed to have been forgotten by everyone including himself, was the tracker's tracker, a man who could follow a trail that existed more in his imagination than in physical reality. He had an almost mystical connection to the wilderness, able to sense the passage of his quarry through means that defied rational explanation. Finally, there was Dutch van der Berg, a massive Dutchman who had immigrated to Georgia specifically to hunt men. Standing 6.5 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Dutch was the group's enforcer, the man they called upon when their quarry needed to be taken alive, but not necessarily unharmed. Together, they represented the pinnacle of the slave-catching profession, men whose reputations extended far beyond the borders of Georgia. They had never failed to bring back their quarry, and they had never encountered a runaway who could evade them for more than a few days. "Gentlemen," Whitfield's voice carried the lazy drawl of plantation aristocracy, each word carefully enunciated in the manner of a man who had never doubted that others would hang on his every syllable. "Today we hunt the most dangerous game of all." He paused for effect, savoring the moment. This wasn't just about reclaiming valuable property. This was about sending a message, about reinforcing the natural order that kept their world functioning as it should. "The buck we're after isn't your typical runaway," Whitfield continued, his pale eyes gleaming with anticipation. "This one's been causing quite the stir among our investments. 7 feet tall, built like a prizefighter, and smart enough to have evaded capture for over 2 months. Briggs spat tobacco juice into the undergrowth, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile. "Colonel, with all due respect, I've been hunting runaways since before you were born. Big, small, smart, stupid. They all bleed the same when you put a bullet in them." "This one's different, Thomas." Whitfield's voice carried a note of warning. "He's not just running, he's fighting back. 3 patrols have gone after him, none came back." The silence that followed this revelation was heavy with implication. In the world of slave hunting, patrols didn't simply disappear. They might be delayed, they might be injured, they might even be killed in accidents, but they always came back. Always. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, his young face betraying the first hint of unease. "What do you mean they didn't come back?" "I mean exactly what I said." Whitfield's voice was cold as winter rain. 12 men, armed with the best weapons money can buy, trained in tracking and hunting human beings. They went into the swamp after our giant and they vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no trace at all. Cross checked his rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, his usual confidence showing the first hairline cracks. "Could be they got lost, turned around in the swamp. It happens." "To 1 patrol, perhaps," Whitfield conceded, "but 3. No, gentlemen, we're dealing with something unprecedented here. A slave who's not just running, but hunting." The word hung in the air like a curse. In their world, slaves were prey by definition. The idea that one might turn predator was so fundamentally contrary to their understanding of the natural order that it bordered on blasphemy. Dutch Vanderberg, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke in his heavily accented English. "In the old country we have saying, 'When you hunt the wolf, remember that the wolf is also hunting you.'" "Perhaps this giant he is wolf, yeah?" Whitfield's laugh was harsh and brittle. "He's property, Dutch, valuable property that needs to be reclaimed and properly disciplined. And when we bring him back, he'll serve as an example to every other slave who thinks they can defy the natural order." But even as he spoke the words, Whitfield felt a cold knot of unease forming in his stomach. The reports from the failed patrols had been disturbing. Witnesses spoke of impossible shots fired from impossible distances, of men who simply vanished in the night, of a giant figure who moved through the swamp like he owned it. More troubling still were the stories that had begun circulating among the slave population. They spoke of a liberator, a warrior who had come to lead them to freedom. They called him by many names: the ghost, the giant, the angel of death. But the message was always the same. Their oppressors were no longer invincible. This couldn't be allowed to continue. The entire system of slavery depended on the myth of white supremacy, on the unquestioned belief that the enslaved were inferior in every way that mattered. If that myth cracked, if slaves began to believe they could fight back successfully, the consequences would be catastrophic. "We'll track him to his lair," Whitfield declared, his voice regaining its customary confidence. "Corner him like the animal he is and bring him back to face justice. And when we do, every slave in Georgia will remember what happens to those who forget their place." The hunting party had been tracking their quarry for 3 days, following a trail that seemed almost too easy to follow. Broken branches here, a footprint there, the occasional piece of torn fabric caught on thorns. To experienced trackers like Briggs and Morrison, the signs painted a clear picture of a desperate man's flight through increasingly treacherous terrain. What they couldn't see, what their arrogance and prejudice blinded them to, was the careful intelligence behind each sign. Every broken branch was precisely placed, every footprint deliberately left, every piece of fabric strategically positioned. They weren't following a fleeing slave. They were being led, guided like sheep to slaughter by a predator who understood their psychology better than they understood themselves. As they pushed deeper into the swampland, The sounds of civilization faded completely. Here, in this primordial wilderness where Spanish moss hung like burial shrouds and the very air seemed thick with menace, the comfortable certainties of their ordered world began to feel increasingly fragile. "He's heading toward Devil's Hollow," Morrison observed, his voice betraying more unease than he intended. "Ain't no good reason for a man to go in there, except he's lost his mind." "Or he knows something we don't," Cross muttered, unconsciously checking his rifle again. Briggs studied the trail with the intensity of a man reading scripture. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The signs were too clear, too obvious. In his experience, truly desperate men didn't leave such easy trails to follow. "Colonel," he said slowly, "I'm starting to think maybe we should reconsider this approach. Get more men, maybe bring some dogs." Whitfield's face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting we retreat, Thomas? That we allow a single slave to dictate terms to us?" "I'm suggesting that maybe this particular slave is more dangerous than we initially thought," Briggs replied carefully. "The smart play might be to—" "The smart play," Whitfield interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade, "is to finish what we started. We are white men, gentlemen. We are the superior race blessed by God and nature with the intelligence and courage to rule over lesser beings. Are we really going to allow ourselves to be intimidated by a runaway slave?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. In their world, to show fear of a slave was to admit fundamental weakness, to crack the very foundation upon which their society was built. One by one, the hunters nodded their agreement, though several did so with obvious reluctance. They were committed now, bound by pride and prejudice, to see this through to its conclusion. As they approached the entrance to Devil's Hollow, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of an ancient oak tree. Isaiah Washington studied his pursuers with the cold calculation of a chess master, examining his opponent's pieces. He could see their formation, their weapons, their body language. More importantly, he could see their arrogance, their unshakable belief in their own superiority. That arrogance would be their downfall. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and the hunters were walking willingly into the killing ground. In a few hours, the myth of white supremacy would die in the Georgia mud, and a new legend would be born. The ghost of Gettysburg was about to become something even more terrifying, a symbol of what happened when the oppressed refused to remain victims. Devil's Hollow earned its name through centuries of death and disappearance. The depression in the earth stretched for nearly 2 miles, filled with ancient cypress trees, whose roots created a labyrinth of natural trenches and hiding spots. Quicksand pockets dotted the landscape like hidden graves, and the air itself seemed to whisper warnings to those wise enough to listen. Local Cherokee had considered the place cursed long before white settlers arrived, telling stories of spirits that claimed the lives of warriors who ventured too deep into its shadows. Spanish explorers in the 1500s had lost entire expeditions in its depths, their bones eventually discovered decades later, picked clean by scavengers and time. Even the hardiest frontiersmen gave the hollow a wide berth, preferring to add days to their journey rather than risk its treacherous paths. But for Isaiah Washington, Devil's Hollow wasn't a place of death. It was a fortress, a sanctuary he had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Every tree, every shadow, every potential line of sight had been memorized and catalogued during his careful reconnaissance. He knew where the solid ground ended and the bog began, where the sight lines were clear, and where they were obscured by hanging moss and twisted branches. More importantly, he had prepared the battlefield, creating hidden caches of ammunition and supplies, establishing multiple escape routes, and setting up observation posts that would allow him to track his enemy's every movement. From his primary position in the hollow of a massive oak tree, a natural sniper's nest that provided both concealment and a commanding view of the approaches, Isaiah watched the hunting party enter his domain. They moved in a loose formation that spoke of confidence bordering on arrogance, their voices carrying further than they intended in the still, humid air. Colonel Whitfield led the group, his expensive rifle held casually across his chest, his pale eyes scanning the terrain with the detached interest of a tourist rather than the focused intensity of a man entering hostile territory. Behind him, Thomas Briggs moved with the careful precision of an experienced tracker. But even his legendary skills were hampered by his fundamental misunderstanding of what they were truly facing. Jake Morrison flanked the group to the left, his young eyes sharp and alert, but his movements betrayed the nervous energy of a man who was beginning to suspect that this hunt was different from any he had experienced before. Samuel Cross took the right flank, his custom rifle at the ready, but his usual confidence was showing signs of strain. Peters moved like a ghost through the undergrowth, his almost supernatural tracking abilities focused on the trail that Isaiah had so carefully laid for them. And bringing up the rear, Dutch Vanderberg's massive frame crashed through the vegetation with all the subtlety of a charging bull, his presence both reassuring and ominous to his companions. "Spread out," Whitfield commanded, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. He can't have gone far. A man that size leaves tracks. Isaiah's lips curved in a grim smile as he listened to the colonel's words. Size was indeed a disadvantage in most situations, but he had learned to turn every perceived weakness into a strength. His height gave him reach and leverage in hand-to-hand combat. His long limbs allowed him to brace his rifle in ways that would be impossible for smaller men, and his imposing presence had a psychological effect on enemies that he had learned to exploit ruthlessly. More importantly, these men were hunting based on assumptions that were fundamentally flawed. They expected to find a frightened runaway, a man driven by desperation and panic. Instead, they were facing a trained soldier, a man who had survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War and had emerged not just alive, but deadlier than ever. The first shot came without warning, a sound that shattered the oppressive silence of the hollow like thunder splitting the sky. Jake Morrison had separated from the others to investigate what looked like a clear footprint in the mud near a stagnant pool. He was bent over, studying the track with the intense concentration of a man trying to read the story it told, when Isaiah's bullet found him. The shot was perfectly placed, a clean kill that took Morrison in the head, dropping him instantly into the murky water without even a cry of alarm. The young tracker's body disappeared beneath the surface with barely a splash, leaving only ripples and a slowly spreading stain of red to mark his passing. The sound of the rifle's shot echoed through the hollow like the voice of death itself, causing birds to explode from the trees in a cacophony of wings and panicked cries. The remaining hunters froze, their heads swiveling as they tried to determine the direction of the shot, their comfortable confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Morrison!" Briggs called out, his voice tight with sudden tension that bordered on panic. "Jake, you answer me right now." Silence was his only reply, a silence so complete and ominous that it seemed to press against them like a physical weight. Whitfield's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan, the color draining from his cheeks as the reality of their situation began to penetrate his arrogant certainty. This wasn't how the hunt was supposed to go. They were the predators here, the superior beings pursuing inferior prey. The natural order demanded that they be the ones dealing death, not receiving it. "Form up!" he barked, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to maintain control. "Back to back. He can't take us all if we stick together." But Isaiah had no intention of facing them all at once. This was guerrilla warfare, the kind of fighting he had perfected during his time with the Union Army, refined through dozens of missions behind enemy lines where a single mistake meant death or worse. Strike fast, strike hard, then disappear before the enemy could respond. Use their expectations against them, exploit their weaknesses, and above all, never fight fair when you could fight smart. Samuel Cross was the next to die, though his death came nearly an hour after Morrison's, an hour that the remaining hunters spent in growing terror as they realized they were being stalked by something far more dangerous than they had imagined. Cross had positioned himself behind what he thought was adequate cover, a fallen log that would have stopped a charging animal but provided no protection against a sniper who could thread a needle at 500 yards. He had been scanning the trees with his rifle scope, searching for any sign of movement, when Isaiah's second shot punched through the rotting wood as if it were paper. The bullet found Cross's heart with surgical precision, the impact spinning him around and dropping him face first into the mud. His expensive rifle flew from his hands, landing in a pool of stagnant water where it would rust away, forgotten and useless. "Jesus Christ!" Briggs shouted, his legendary composure finally cracking like ice in spring. Where is he? Where the hell is he shooting from? The remaining 3 hunters, Whitfield, Briggs, and Peters, pressed themselves against the largest tree they could find. Their rifles pointed in every direction at once as they tried to cover all possible approaches. But the forest had gone silent again, as if the very wilderness was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Dutch van der Berg, who had been bringing up the rear when Cross was killed, had simply vanished. One moment he was there, his massive frame visible through the trees, and the next he was gone as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The others called his name, but received no answer except the mocking echo of their own voices. Isaiah had already moved to a new position, using a network of game trails and hidden paths that he had scouted weeks earlier. He was now behind them, with a clear shot at any of the 3 remaining hunters, but he waited. Fear was a weapon as deadly as any bullet, and he could see it working on his enemies like acid, eating away at their confidence and their sanity. From his new position, concealed in a tangle of Spanish moss and cypress branches, Isaiah could see the sweat beading on their faces despite the cool shade of the hollow. He could hear their rapid breathing, see the way their hands trembled as they gripped their weapons with white-knuckled desperation. These men had spent their lives terrorizing others, using fear as a tool of control and domination. They had hunted human beings like animals, broken up families, destroyed lives, all while telling themselves that they were the superior race, that their actions were justified by the natural order of things. Now they were experiencing that same terror, and they had no idea how to handle it. Fear was a foreign emotion to them, something they inflicted on others but never experienced themselves. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. Every moment they spent in terror, every second they wondered when the next shot would come, weakened them further. Isaiah had learned this lesson in the crucible of war, where he had discovered that a frightened enemy makes mistakes, and mistakes were fatal. Confederate soldiers who had faced him spoke of the psychological pressure of knowing that death could come from any direction, at any distance, without warning. Some had broken under that pressure, abandoning their posts or deserting entirely, rather than face the ghost of Gettysburg. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows through the hollow and turning the already ominous landscape into something that belonged in a nightmare, Isaiah prepared for the next phase of his plan. The hunters had become the hunted, but the lesson was far from over. Peters was the next to go, though his death was different from the others. The tracker had been trying to circle around to flank their unseen enemy when he stepped into one of the many quicksand pits that dotted the hollow. Isaiah watched from his concealed position as the man struggled frantically, his cries for help echoing through the trees as he slowly sank into the hungry earth. Whitfield and Briggs could hear Peters screaming, but they didn't dare leave their position to help him. They knew that the moment they exposed themselves, they would join Morrison and Cross in death. So they listened in horror as their companions' cries grew weaker and more desperate, until finally they stopped altogether, leaving only the sound of bubbling mud and the distant call of a mourning dove. "This ain't right," Briggs whispered, his voice shaking with a terror he had never experienced before. "This ain't how it's supposed to go. We're the hunters here." "Shut up," Whitfield hissed, but his own voice betrayed his growing panic. The comfortable certainty of his superiority was crumbling with each passing moment, each death chipping away at the foundation of his worldview. The myth of white supremacy that had sustained him his entire life, that had justified every cruelty and every injustice, was proving to be exactly that, a myth. In this primordial wilderness, stripped of the social structures and institutional advantages that had always protected him, he was discovering that he was just a man, mortal, fallible, and ultimately vulnerable. As darkness began to fall over Devil's Hollow, Isaiah prepared for the final act of this deadly drama. 2 men remained, 2 representatives of a system built on oppression and maintained through terror. Soon, they would learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that terror. The ghost of Gettysburg was about to become something even more frightening, a symbol of justice, delivered at the end of a rifle barrel in the heart of the Georgia wilderness. Night fell over Devil's Hollow like a shroud, bringing with it a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. The oppressive heat of the day gave way to a clammy chill that seeped through clothing and settled in the bones, while the air grew thick with mist that rose from the stagnant pools and hidden waterways that threaded through the swamp. For Thomas Briggs and Colonel Marcus Whitfield, pressed against the rough bark of an ancient cypress tree, the darkness was both blessing and curse. It might hide them from their unseen enemy, but it also concealed threats that could come from any direction. Every sound, the splash of a fish jumping, the rustle of Spanish moss in the breeze, the distant call of a night bird, sent jolts of terror through their already frayed nerves. They had been in this position for over 6 hours now, afraid to move, afraid to speak above a whisper, afraid to do anything that might draw the attention of the predator who stalked them through the shadows. Their water was running low, their ammunition was limited, and their sanity was hanging by an increasingly thin thread. "We can't stay here forever," Briggs whispered urgently to Whitfield, his voice barely audible even at close range. "He's picking us off one by one. We need to move, find better cover, or get the hell out of here entirely." "And go where?" Whitfield's aristocratic composure had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw terror of a man who suddenly realized he wasn't the apex predator he'd always believed himself to be. "He knows this place better than we do. He's probably got every escape route covered." The colonel's words carried more truth than he realized. Isaiah had indeed prepared for every contingency, mapping out not just the hollow itself, but all the approaches and exits. He had spent weeks studying the terrain, learning its secrets, turning it into an extension of his will. This wasn't just his battlefield, it was his domain, and he ruled it absolutely. From his current position in the canopy of a massive oak tree, Isaiah could see his remaining enemies clearly despite the darkness. Years of night fighting during the war had taught him to use shadows and starlight to his advantage, while his intimate knowledge of the hollow allowed him to move silently through terrain that would challenge a Cherokee scout. He had been watching them for hours, studying their body language, listening to their whispered conversations, learning everything he could about their mental state. Fear was radiating from them like heat from a forge, and he could see it in every nervous gesture, every flinch at unexpected sounds, every desperate glance into the surrounding darkness. But Isaiah wasn't ready to end this yet. These men represented something larger than themselves. They were symbols of a system that had enslaved his people for generations, that had treated human beings like livestock, that had built its wealth and power on the backs of the oppressed. Their deaths would be more than simple revenge. They would be a message, a declaration that the age of unquestioned white supremacy was coming to an end. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. Every moment these men spent in terror was a moment when the myth of their superiority cracked a little more. Every second they cowered in fear was a second when they experienced what their victims had felt for centuries. As the night deepened, Isaiah began the final phase of his plan. Moving with the silence of a ghost, he descended from his perch and began to circle his enemies, staying just outside their line of sight, but close enough that they could occasionally catch glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision. The effect was devastating. Briggs and Whitfield found themselves jumping at shadows, spinning around to face threats that vanished the moment they looked directly at them. Their nerves, already stretched to the breaking point, began to snap under the relentless pressure. "Did you see that?" Whitfield whispered frantically, pointing his rifle at a patch of darkness that seemed no different from any other. "Something moved over there." "I don't see anything," Briggs replied, but his voice shook with uncertainty. He had been a tracker for over 20 years, had developed instincts that had kept him alive in situations that would have killed lesser men. But those same instincts were now screaming warnings that he couldn't ignore. Isaiah allowed them to catch a clearer glimpse of him as he moved between two trees, just enough to confirm that their stalker was real and not a product of their deteriorating mental state. The sight of his massive silhouette moving through the darkness with predatory grace sent both men into near panic. "There!" Briggs shouted, abandoning all pretense of stealth as he fired wildly into the shadows. "I saw him! He's right there!" His shots went wide, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding him and revealing his position to anyone watching. Whitfield joined in, emptying his rifle in a desperate fusillade that accomplished nothing except to waste ammunition and announce their location to every creature within miles. When the echoes of their gunfire finally faded, the silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. They had revealed their position, wasted their ammunition, and accomplished nothing except to demonstrate their own desperation and incompetence. "Reload," Whitfield ordered, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely manage to work the mechanism of his rifle. "Stay calm, we can get through this." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. They weren't going to get through this. They were going to die in this God-forsaken swamp, killed by a man they had dismissed as inferior, a piece of property that had dared to fight back. Isaiah's voice cut through the darkness like a blade, coming from a direction that seemed impossible, given where they had last seen him. "Colonel Marcus Whitfield." The voice was deep, resonant, carrying clearly through the humid air, despite being spoken at conversational volume. "Owner of the Whitfield plantation, buyer and seller of human beings, do you know who I am?" Whitfield's blood turned to ice in his veins. The voice was educated, articulate, carrying none of the dialect or subservience that he expected from a slave. This was the voice of an equal, perhaps even a superior, and that realization shattered something fundamental in his worldview. You're just a runaway slave," Whitfield called back, his voice cracking with strain. "I don't know what game you're playing, but you're still property. You belong to me." Laughter echoed through the hollow, rich and deep, and utterly without humor. "My name is Sergeant Isaiah Washington, 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, United States Army, and I have never belonged to anyone." The words hit Whitfield like physical blows. This wasn't just a runaway slave. This was a Union soldier, a trained killer who had been hunting Confederate officers like sport. The implications crashed over him like a tidal wave, washing away the last vestiges of his confidence. You're the ghost of Gettysburg," Whitfield whispered, a recognition dawning like a nightmare coming to life. "The sniper who's been killing our officers." "Among others," Isaiah confirmed, his voice now coming from a completely different direction, demonstrating his ability to move unseen through terrain that the hunters could barely navigate in daylight. "Your boys at Chancellorsville, your cavalry at Brandy Station, your artillery crews at Fredericksburg, all of them learned the same lesson you're about to learn." Briggs broke first, his legendary composure finally shattering under the relentless psychological pressure. With a scream of pure terror, he abandoned Whitfield and ran blindly through the hollow, crashing through undergrowth and splashing through hidden pools of stagnant water. He made it perhaps 100 yards before Isaiah's shot found him. The bullet took him in the back, the impact sending him face first into the mud where he lay still, his body slowly sinking into the hungry earth that had already claimed Peters. Now it was just Whitfield and Isaiah, predator and prey, though the roles had been completely reversed from how the day had begun. Colonel Marcus Whitfield stood alone in the hollow, his expensive hunting rifle clutched in hands that shook like autumn leaves. The man who had begun the day as a confident hunter, secure in his position at the top of the social hierarchy, was now a cornered animal, his carefully constructed world of privilege and power crumbling around him. "I know you can hear me," Whitfield called out, his voice echoing off the trees with desperate bravado. "I'm a colonel in the Confederate Army. I have money, influence. We can make a deal." Isaiah stepped out from behind a massive cypress tree, his rifle trained on Whitfield's chest. At this distance, perhaps 30 yards, the colonel could see his enemy clearly for the first time. What he saw defied every stereotype, every assumption he had ever held about the enslaved. This was no cowering field hand or broken house servant. This was a warrior, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced death countless times and emerged victorious. His dark skin seemed to absorb the moonlight, making him appear almost supernatural, while his eyes burned with an intelligence that was both terrifying and undeniable. "My name," Isaiah said, his voice carrying clearly across the hollow, "is Sergeant Isaiah Washington, 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, and I am not your property." Whitfield's eyes widened as the full implications hit him. This wasn't just a runaway slave or even a Union soldier. This was living proof that everything he had been taught about racial superiority was a lie. Here stood a man who was clearly his intellectual equal, possibly his superior, who had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought him at every turn. You're just a... Whitfield began, but the words died in his throat as he met Isaiah's gaze. There was no hatred there, no rage, just the cold calculation of a professional soldier doing his job. "I'm just a what, Colonel?" Isaiah asked quietly. "A slave? Property? Something less than human?" He shook his head slowly. "I am a free man fighting for the freedom of my people, and you are a slaver, a man who built his wealth on the suffering of others." Whitfield raised his rifle with desperate speed, but Isaiah was faster. His shot took the colonel's center mass, the impact spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the mud. As Whitfield gasped his last breaths, Isaiah approached slowly, his rifle still ready. "You came here to hunt a man for sport," he said quietly. "But you forgot something important. Sometimes the prey fights back." The colonel's eyes were already glazing over, but Isaiah continued speaking, his words carrying the weight of generations of suffering and resistance. "You and men like you have spent centuries telling yourselves that you're superior, that your dominance is natural and right. But here in this place, stripped of your advantages and your institutions, you've learned the truth." Whitfield tried to speak, but only blood came from his lips. "The truth," Isaiah continued, "is that you were never superior. You were just men with guns, backed by laws that said you could own other human beings. But laws can be changed, and men with guns can be killed." The hollow fell silent, except for the gentle whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a mourning dove. 6 men had entered this place as hunters. Only one would leave. But Isaiah's work was far from over. This had been more than a simple act of revenge. It had been a declaration of war against the entire system of slavery, a message that would spread far beyond the borders of Georgia. Dawn broke over Devil's Hollow with the pale, uncertain light of a world forever changed. The mist that had shrouded the swamp during the night began to lift, revealing a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful in the morning sun. Spanish moss swayed gently in the breeze, birds called from hidden perches, and the water reflected the sky like mirrors scattered throughout the wilderness. But beneath this serene surface lay the bodies of 6 men who had entered the hollow as confident predators and died as terrified prey. Their expensive rifles lay rusted and forgotten in the mud, their fine clothes torn and stained with blood and swamp water. Their dreams of easy conquest transformed into a nightmare that would echo through history. Isaiah Washington moved through the aftermath of the battle with methodical efficiency, showing no emotion as he went through the belongings of the men who had hunted him like an animal. This wasn't cruelty or revenge. This was war. And in war, resources were precious and intelligence was invaluable. From Whitfield's body, he recovered a detailed map of Confederate positions in the region, along with correspondence that revealed planned troop movements and supply routes. The colonel's arrogance had extended to carrying sensitive military information on what he had assumed would be a simple hunting expedition, never imagining that his quarry might be intelligent enough to make use of such documents. Briggs carried a notebook filled with detailed information about underground railroad routes and safe houses, intelligence that would have been devastating in Confederate hands, but would prove invaluable to Union forces working to help escaped slaves reach freedom. The irony wasn't lost on Isaiah. The very men who had dedicated their lives to hunting runaway slaves had inadvertently provided him with the tools to help even more escape to freedom. From the others, he gathered ammunition, food, and personal effects that would help him maintain his cover as he continued his mission behind enemy lines. But more importantly, he found letters and documents that painted a clear picture of the Confederate mindset, revealing the fears and weaknesses that he could exploit in future operations. As Isaiah prepared to leave the hollow, he paused at the edge of the killing ground and looked back at the scene. 6 bodies lay scattered among the cypress roots, testament to what happened when predators underestimated their prey. But this wasn't just about these 6 men. It was about something much larger, something that would reshape the very foundations of American society. The myth of white supremacy that had justified slavery, that had convinced men like Whitfield they were inherently superior to those they oppressed, lay as dead as the men in the mud. Isaiah had proven that when stripped of their advantages, their wealth, their social position, their institutional power, they were just men, mortal, fallible, and ultimately vulnerable. But proving a point and spreading a message were two different things. Isaiah understood that the real power of what had happened in Devil's Hollow wouldn't come from the deaths themselves, but from how the story was told and retold, how it spread through both the slave quarters and the Confederate ranks, how it changed the way people thought about the war and about themselves. Before leaving the Hollow, Isaiah took one final step that would ensure his message reached the widest possible audience. From Whitfield's body, he removed the colonel's distinctive gold pocket watch, a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of plantation owners. On the back of the watch, he carefully carved a simple message with his knife: "The ghost was here." Then he placed the watch in a prominent position where it would be easily found by whoever eventually came looking for the missing hunting party. The discovery of Whitfield's watch, along with the bodies of his companions, would send shockwaves through the Confederate command structure and the plantation system that supported it. Word of what happened in Devil's Hollow began to spread within days, carried by the complex network of communication that existed among the enslaved population. House servants overheard worried conversations between their masters. Field hands noticed the increased patrols and tightened security, and everyone understood that something significant had happened. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do. Some versions claimed that Isaiah had killed 12 men instead of 6, that he could shoot the wings off a fly at 1,000 yards, that he could appear and disappear at will like a true ghost. Others focused on the psychological aspects of the battle, describing how the mighty Colonel Whitfield had died begging for mercy in the mud of a Georgia swamp. But regardless of the embellishments, the core message remained the same. A former slave had faced down 6 of the South's most experienced manhunters and emerged victorious. The oppressed had become the oppressor, the hunted had become the hunter, and the myth of white supremacy had been shattered by the reality of black excellence. In the slave quarters of plantations across Georgia, the story was told in whispers and coded songs, passed from person to person like a sacred flame. Children who had never known anything but bondage heard tales of a giant warrior who fought for their freedom, while adults who had given up hope began to believe that liberation might actually be possible. The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Slaves who had been broken by years of abuse began to stand a little straighter to look their masters in the eye, to remember that they were human beings with dignity and worth. The fear that had kept the system functioning began to crack, replaced by something far more dangerous to the established order: hope. But the story didn't just spread among the enslaved. Confederate soldiers, already demoralized by a war that was going badly, heard whispered accounts of the ghost of Gettysburg and his latest victory. Officers who had dismissed reports of a supernatural sniper as superstition began to take the threat seriously, implementing new security protocols and changing their behavior patterns. The effect on Confederate morale was devastating. Soldiers who had been told they were fighting to preserve a superior civilization found themselves wondering if that civilization was as superior as they had been led to believe. If a single former slave could outfight and outthink 6 of their best men, what did that say about the fundamental assumptions upon which their society was built? Union forces, meanwhile, used the intelligence that Isaiah had gathered to devastating effect. The maps and documents he had recovered from Whitfield's body revealed Confederate positions and plans that had been closely guarded secrets. Within weeks, Union raids had disrupted supply lines, captured strategic positions, and freed hundreds of enslaved people who had been working on Confederate fortifications. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Devil's Hollow became a recruiting tool for the Union cause. Free blacks in the North who had been hesitant to join the fight saw in Isaiah Washington proof that they could make a real difference in the war. Enslaved people in the South began to actively seek out Union forces, knowing that they would be welcomed as soldiers rather than returned to their masters. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the summer and fall of 1863. Plantation owners who had once felt secure in their dominance began to sleep with loaded weapons beside their beds. Overseers who had terrorized slaves with impunity found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering if the ghost might be watching them through a rifle scope. The Underground Railroad, energized by the intelligence Isaiah had provided and inspired by his example, began operating with unprecedented boldness and efficiency. Safe houses that had been compromised were abandoned, new routes were established, and the flow of freedom seekers increased dramatically. Confederate authorities, desperate to restore order and confidence, put a massive bounty on Isaiah's head, $10,000 for his capture, dead or alive. It was an enormous sum, more than most men would see in a lifetime, but it had an effect opposite to what was intended. Rather than encouraging bounty hunters, it served as proof of how dangerous and important Isaiah had become. The bounty also had an unintended consequence. It elevated Isaiah from a local threat to a national symbol. Newspapers in the North picked up the story, describing him as a hero of the Union cause and a symbol of black resistance. Abolitionists used his example to argue for the full participation of African Americans in the war effort, while politicians pointed to his success as proof that emancipation was not just morally right, but militarily necessary. In the South, the response was more complex. While Confederate leaders publicly dismissed Isaiah as a terrorist and criminal, privately they were forced to confront the implications of his success. If one former slave could cause this much disruption, what would happen if thousands more followed his example? Some Confederate officers began to advocate for changes in how enslaved people were treated, arguing that harsh conditions only created more potential rebels. Others pushed for even harsher measures, believing that only through increased brutality could the slave system be maintained. But the damage was already done. The myth of white supremacy, once unquestioned and absolute, had been cracked by the reality of what had happened in Devil's Hollow. That crack would continue to widen as the war progressed, eventually becoming the fissure that would bring down the entire system of slavery. As autumn turned to winter, Isaiah Washington continued his work behind enemy lines, but he was no longer just a sniper or a soldier. He had become something far more powerful and dangerous to the Confederate cause. He had become a symbol of what was possible when the oppressed refused to accept their oppression. The ghost of Gettysburg had evolved into something even more terrifying to those who built their power on the subjugation of others. He had become the embodiment of justice, delivered at the end of a rifle barrel in the heart of the American wilderness. And his legend was just beginning. Winter came early to Georgia in 1863, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the Confederacy. The war was going badly for the South, with Union forces pressing their advantage on multiple fronts, but nowhere was the psychological impact more profound than in the region around Devil's Hollow, where the legend of Isaiah Washington continued to grow with each passing day. The discovery of Colonel Whitfield's hunting party had sent shockwaves through the Confederate command structure that were still reverberating months later. The sight of 6 experienced manhunters lying dead in the mud, their expensive weapons useless beside them, had shattered more than just military confidence. It had cracked the very foundation of Southern society. General Braxton Bragg, commanding Confederate forces in the region, had personally visited the site of the massacre, studying the scene with the eye of a professional soldier. What he found there had disturbed him more than any battlefield defeat. This hadn't been a conventional engagement between opposing forces. This had been a systematic dismantling of everything the Confederacy claimed to represent. "Gentlemen," Bragg had told his staff officers after returning from Devil's Hollow, his voice heavy with implications that none of them wanted to acknowledge, "we are not dealing with a simple runaway slave or even a conventional enemy soldier. We are facing something far more dangerous, a symbol that threatens the very order we are fighting to preserve." The general's words proved prophetic. As winter deepened, reports of Isaiah's activities continued to filter in from across the region. Confederate supply convoys found their guards dead with impossible shots through the head. Officers disappeared from their quarters in the night, leaving behind only the ghost's calling card, an ace of spades with justice written in careful script. Entire patrols vanished into the wilderness, their fate unknown but easily imagined. But it wasn't just the military impact that concerned Confederate leadership. It was the effect on the civilian population, both white and black. The story of Devil's Hollow had taken on a life of its own. spreading through the complex networks of communication that existed in the antebellum South. In the slave quarters of plantations across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina, the tale was told and retold, each version adding new details and embellishments. Isaiah Washington had become more than a man. He was a legend, a symbol of hope for millions who had known only bondage and despair. Children who had never seen a free black person heard stories of the giant who fought for their liberation. Adults who had been broken by years of abuse found new strength in the knowledge that one of their own had faced down the system that oppressed them and emerged victorious. The psychological chains that had kept slavery functioning began to weaken as people remembered that they were human beings with dignity and worth. The effect was immediate and profound. Plantation owners who had once ruled their domains with absolute authority found themselves facing subtle but persistent resistance. Work slowdowns became more common, tools mysteriously broke more frequently, and the careful surveillance network that had kept slaves in line began to break down as people found new courage to resist. More dramatically, the number of escape attempts increased exponentially. The Underground Railroad, energized by Isaiah's example and equipped with the intelligence he had provided, began operating with unprecedented boldness. Safe houses that had been abandoned as too dangerous were reopened. New routes were established through previously impassable terrain, and the flow of freedom seekers increased to levels that strained Confederate resources to the breaking point. Union forces, meanwhile, found themselves dealing with an unexpected windfall of intelligence and recruits. Escaped slaves who made it to Union lines brought with them detailed knowledge of Confederate positions, troop movements, and supply routes. More importantly, they brought a burning desire to fight for their freedom and the freedom of those they had left behind. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, Isaiah's original unit, became a symbol of black military excellence that attracted volunteers from across the North. Young men who had been hesitant to join the fight saw in Isaiah's example proof that they could make a real difference in the war. The regiment's ranks swelled with recruits eager to follow in the footsteps of the ghost of Gettysburg. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the regiment's commanding officer, understood the significance of what Isaiah had accomplished. In letters to his family, Shaw wrote, "The actions of Sergeant Washington have done more to advance the cause of Negro equality than a dozen political speeches. He has proven beyond doubt that courage, intelligence, and military skill know no color." But Shaw also understood the burden that Isaiah carried. The young sergeant had become more than a soldier. He was a symbol, a representative of his entire race in the eyes of both friend and enemy. Every action he took, every decision he made, would be scrutinized and judged not just on its military merit, but on what it said about the capabilities of African Americans as a whole. The pressure was enormous, but Isaiah seemed to thrive under it. Reports from Union spies and escaped slaves painted a picture of a man who had transcended his original mission to become something approaching a force of nature. He moved through Confederate territory like a ghost, striking where and when he chose, always staying one step ahead of the massive manhunt that had been organized to capture him. The bounty on his head had grown to $25,000, an astronomical sum that reflected both his importance to the Union cause and the desperation of Confederate authorities to stop him. Wanted posters bearing his likeness appeared in towns across the South, but they served more to spread his legend than to aid in his capture. The psychological warfare that Isaiah had perfected in Devil's Hollow continued to evolve and expand. He began leaving more elaborate calling cards at the scenes of his operations, not just playing cards, but carefully crafted messages that spoke directly to the fears and insecurities of his enemies. At the site of a destroyed Confederate supply depot, he left a note that read, "To the officers of the Confederate Army, you have spent your lives telling yourselves that you are superior to those you enslave. I am here to teach you otherwise." The Ghost. At a plantation where he had helped dozens of slaves escape, he left a different message. "To my brothers and sisters in bondage, your chains are not as strong as they appear. Freedom is within your grasp if you have the courage to reach for it. A friend." These messages, copied and distributed throughout both the Union and Confederate territories, had an impact far beyond their simple words. They demonstrated that Isaiah was not just a killer, but a thinker, a strategist who understood the power of ideas as well as bullets. Confederate newspapers, desperate to counter his growing influence, began publishing articles that attempted to diminish his achievements. They claimed he was a myth, a propaganda creation of the Union Army designed to inspire false hope among the enslaved population. They argued that no single man could accomplish what was being attributed to the ghost of Gettysburg, but these efforts backfired spectacularly. By acknowledging Isaiah's existence and attempting to explain away his successes, Confederate media only served to spread his legend further. More importantly, their obvious desperation to counter his influence revealed just how much damage he was doing to their cause. Union newspapers, meanwhile, embraced Isaiah as a hero of the Republic. The New York Tribune published a series of articles detailing his exploits, while Harper's Weekly featured illustrations of his battles that captured the imagination of readers across the North. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and former slave, wrote eloquently about Isaiah's significance. In the person of Sergeant Isaiah Washington, we see the future of our race in America. He is proof that when given the opportunity and training, the Negro can excel in any field of human endeavor. His rifle speaks not just for himself, but for millions of our people who yearn for the chance to prove their worth. But perhaps the most significant impact of Isaiah's legend was on the enslaved population itself. The story of Devil's Hollow had become a touchstone, a proof that resistance was possible and that victory was achievable. In the coded songs and stories that passed through the slave quarters, Isaiah became a figure of almost mythical proportions. Some versions of his story took on religious overtones, with Isaiah cast as a Moses figure leading his people to freedom. Others emphasized his military prowess, describing impossible shots and supernatural abilities. But all versions carried the same essential message: the oppressed could become the oppressor. The hunted could become the hunter, and freedom was worth any sacrifice. The effect on Confederate morale continued to deteriorate throughout the winter. Soldiers who had once been confident in their cause found themselves questioning everything they had been taught about racial superiority. Officers who had dismissed the threat of slave rebellion began to see potential enemies in every face, potential snipers behind every tree. Desertion rates in Confederate units operating in Georgia and the surrounding states reached alarming levels. Men who had signed up to fight for Southern independence found themselves unwilling to face the ghost of Gettysburg and what he represented. Some deserted to avoid the possibility of encountering him. Others, because they had begun to question the righteousness of their cause. The economic impact was equally severe. Plantation owners, terrified of slave uprisings inspired by Isaiah's example, began selling their human property at below-market prices, flooding the slave markets and depressing prices across the region. Some abandoned their plantations entirely, fleeing to areas they considered safer from the influence of the ghost. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for slave property began refusing to write new policies or canceling existing ones. The entire economic structure of the antebellum South, built on the assumption that enslaved labor was a stable and controllable resource, began to show signs of fundamental instability. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of renewed military campaigns, Isaiah Washington had achieved something that no Union general had managed. He had struck at the very heart of what the Confederacy was fighting to preserve. The myth of white supremacy, the foundation upon which the entire system of slavery rested, lay in ruins in the mud of Devil's Hollow. But Isaiah's greatest victory was yet to come. As the war entered its final phase, his legend would inspire a generation of African Americans to take up arms for their freedom, while his example would help convince a nation that equality was not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity. The ghost of Gettysburg had become something more than a sniper, more than a soldier, more than a symbol. He had become the embodiment of a truth that would reshape America, that freedom once tasted could never be forgotten, and that those who sought to deny it to others did so at their own peril. The legend that began in Devil's Hollow would outlive the war, outlive the century, and continue to inspire those who fought for justice long after the last shot of the Civil War had been fired. In the end, Isaiah Washington's greatest weapon wasn't his rifle. It was the idea that he represented, the proof that no system of oppression could stand forever against the human spirit's desire for liberty. And that idea, once planted, would grow and spread until it transformed a nation and changed the world. If this incredible fictional story of courage, strategy, and ultimate justice moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we bring you the most powerful stories, some inspired by real events, others from the imagination, showcasing how ordinary people can rise to face extraordinary challenges. This tale of Isaiah Washington reminds us that heroes come in all forms, and that even in fiction, sometimes the greatest weapon against oppression is the refusal to accept it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message of resilience and never giving up. No matter how impossible the odds may seem, what other forgotten heroes from history or from fiction would you like us to feature? Let us know in the comments below.